Thank you so much, Tamara. It's frankly a pleasure for me to be here. And thank you to all the participants that took the time to listen to me. I hope it won't be too boring. Basically, I will try to make it as much as really passing on the experience presentation rather than an actual explanation on what we did. But first, let me just introduce myself. As you know, my name is Costanza Fielbo. I'm Associate Program Specialist at the Cultural Unit of the UNESCO Regional Bureau for Science and Culture in Europe. It is based in Venice, but we have an antenna in Sarajevo. So we work mostly in Southeast Europe, but our mandate and programmatic mandate is, let's say, covers the whole European region. In this context, back in 2019, we were part of a project proposal for the Horizon 2020 program, which is, of course, not existing anymore. I don't know to what extent. I think you're all more or less familiar with the Horizon Europe program, which is the current one providing opportunities also in the cultural field. Cultural natural heritage, cultural tourism. We have recently been reached out by a new project that is indeed funded by Horizon Europe, and it is about cultural tourism. And indeed, they wanted some, inputs and lessons learned from the Smart Culture project. So in 2019, we submitted this application, and then within a consortium of more than 10 partners, we were responsible. I will now explain of which part of the project and why this part is particularly relevant, I think, and Tamara agrees, otherwise I would not be here, to the topic of culture and tourism. So let me share my screen. And let me know if you can see it, please. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
Yes.
Perfect. So I don't know why, but if I don't move this, okay, I cannot put the full screen. Great. So what we will be talking about mostly today is a specific part of the project, of this Smart Culture project, which was somehow the cornerstone of the whole project, and namely what we defined sustainable cultural tourism laboratories. We'll delve into the topic of the so-called living labs. Most probably you're already familiar with what a living lab is, but the added value of this project was testing such kind of tool in the context of sustainable cultural tourism. So this is a very preliminary slide on why UNESCO joined the Smart Culture Consortium. As you know, we are the only UN specialized agency in the field of culture, but tourism per se is not part of our mandate. Otherwise, the World Tourism Organization would not exist. But still, since Smart Culture was about sustainable cultural tourism, the idea of promoting local cultural resources and making them become basically a driver for sustainable development of communities and territories made this project particularly relevant to our mandate. So basically, this touched upon two main pillars, I would say, of the UNESCO's cultural program. On the one hand, it was the preservation and protection of cultural and natural heritage. On the other, the promotion and safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, herein included, let's say, the craftsmanship, which is, of course, an important resource when it comes to local sustainable development. So this is a bit an overview of how the project was designed. Again, if you're familiar with European projects, but in general, project management lately is very often organized per work packages. So we will focus on work package 6, that I was saying was the cornerstone of the project. Why this was the case? Because if on the one hand, the idea was to redefine the concept of sustainable cultural tourism, starting really from the definition of what sustainable cultural tourism is, which is a tourism that, of course, allows for the development of the territory without infringing upon the values of the natural and cultural heritage, but instead contributing to their preservation and promotion. Then we had a series of other activities that in any case needed to be somehow, that on the one hand fed the living labs and on the other needed to be tested in the living labs. This is why you see all the arrows going in double direction. So we did an assessment of the state of the art of cultural and tourism policies and interventions, really mapping all over Europe more than 100 different cultural tourism interventions, then assessing how those cultural tourism interventions effectively impact the sustainable development of a territory, of a community, of a, let's say, of an endroit in its entirety. And then we developed some tools. Of course, it was not UNESCO. UNESCO, we will see in a second, was mainly coordinating these 6 living labs in Europe, but still we put the conditions for these tools that were developed on purpose within the project to be tested and to actually help local stakeholders to better devise sustainable tourism interventions for their territories. These tools can be found on the Smart Culture website. Maybe later on we could have a look together so that I can guide you through. It's not, sometimes it might be counterintuitive, but why I'm stressing this, because the so-called Smart Culture Toolkit is basically a repository of service design tools and art-based methods that are, let's say, primarily aimed at better engaging local communities into discussion, into co-designing of interventions, and more specifically of sustainable cultural tourism interventions. The time span, just I wish to stress this because you have just to think that our start date was January 2020. This means that 3 months after COVID broke out. This meant that the very, first in a year and a half, it was very difficult to, implement the project, especially considering the kind of engagement of people and exchanges that this project was based upon. So UNESCO's role in the project was, as mentioned, that of coordinating the activities of these 6 living labs. We will see in a second which were these living labs. And the idea was to translate the participatory approaches that are very much, let's say, embodied in the spirit of the 2003 Convention into another kind of domain. So ICH per se was, of course, one of the topics, for instance, of awareness raising and capacity building actions, but most importantly, the approaches and methodologies of ICH safeguarding were translated and embedded into the methodologies of the project. This is the map of the 6 living labs, as you may see, and we will see how this affected overall the project. The 6 living labs were spread out over Europe. So we had Split in Croatia, we had Vicenza in Italy, we had the Huesca province, that is the north part of Spain, basically in the Pre-Pyrenees. We had Gelderland, which is in the Flanders, Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and finally the Utsjoki municipality, that is the northernmost municipality in Finland. Basically from Utsjoki you can watch Norway across the river. So very diverse territories, communities involved, challenges, and this raised some challenges, but also opened up for some opportunities. What do we mean by saying living labs? We will see in a second more specifically what is a living lab, but basically the idea is that of gathering several different typologies of stakeholders towards approaching and addressing a common challenge, or working towards a common objective. The objective here, of course, was promoting sustainable cultural tourism at destination level in these 6 different destinations. And the overall, let's say, project had as underlying principle that of being as much as context-based and context-specific as possible. So this means that what you see on the screen are just some of the categories, most of the categories, I would say, of the typologies of stakeholders that were involved in the living labs. But of course, not in each of them, all of these categories were represented, because in some of them, well, academics was more or less, transversal, so as residents, but in some destinations it was easier to reach out to the civil society than in others. In some, the local authorities were more prominent, in others were not really engaged or interested. The same applies to transport authorities, to culture and creative industries. So this, let's say, a mapping. In other words, what each lab manager did, and this is the main, let's say, the key point of how we structured the overall process, was to conduct as a first action a stakeholder mapping. What are lab managers? As I said, 6 living labs, but 10 partners. Among these 10 partners, we had 6 of them that were based in the 6 destinations of that were chosen for the creation of a living lab. And thus, they were mostly either research institutes or universities. And within their team, they appointed a lab manager that could be a specific person or a group of people to ensure basically the day-to-day management of the living lab. The typology of labs that we're talking about are the so-called, the literature called them provider-driven labs, meaning that we were not there to, we were not expecting as an output actual business innovation or a product, but rather the focus was on enhancing the knowledge and supporting theory development, skills, and capacities. This is why this was very much aligned also with the choice of the specific lab managers, because of course we're talking about a group of people that already do this in their daily work. Most of them, of course, were from the tourism or cultural department of the different universities involved. So having already a network and having already especially a sense of the challenges that the local community and the destination was facing or is facing. The idea of the Living Lab was, as mentioned, to co-create, to co-design solutions that could enhance local sustainable development, but more specifically could really benefit local communities towards the development of tourism. Sometimes tourism is seen as, for instance, my office is based in Venice. Can you imagine what this does mean? You do imagine, most probably you do know, but the wish was that of making residents, making citizens having an active role in deciding what kind of tourism they wanted. And this was done through a series of action. Basically, the living labs were created in late 2020 and they ran until June 2023. So it was a long way. And we will see how there were different challenges, but the engagement of stakeholders and the actual involvement and interest of stakeholders changed over time for several different reasons, while still the main objective of the project and of the living labs per se was that of ensuring that participatory approaches to the governance, to the policy making of cultural tourism were enacted with an actual and effective involvement of local communities. So the first thing we did to basically set up these living labs was drafting some standard terms of reference. What they aimed basically at being a guidance for lab managers to set up the living lab, to imagine how the living lab should have been, to set the boundaries, but also keeping a flexibility towards, of course, the specific context of the different destinations. Based on these basically common guidelines, then specific terms of reference were developed for each and every living lab. And this was very much based on consultations with local stakeholders, on desk research, on the situation, on the local scenario, on the main needs. A stakeholder mapping was undertook in the context of this inception phase, actually to map all stakeholders that could have been relevant, considering the needs, the gaps, the priorities of the destination. So once the specific terms of reference were drafted, and towards the drafting of these terms of reference per se, stakeholders started to gather, to be invited to meetings that at the very beginning were mostly informal meetings and online meetings, as we were in COVID time. But this first group then became more and more structured, more and more, let's say, stable somehow, even though we will see how the number of people changed over time. So this is a bit what I already mentioned, what the specific terms of reference were aimed at. So doing a context analysis, a stakeholder mapping, assessing needs and priorities, already starting to imagine what would have been the appropriate number of stakeholders to be involved to make it manageable, but at the same time meaningful. With this always underlying objective of being community-based and objective-driven entities. So really the needs then, the local needs then became objectives. This is a bit the methodology that was adopted. It's the so-called double diamond design process. It's the methodology that somehow was adopted throughout the lifespan of each living lab. So a first phase that was more about discovering, so identifying the local needs, the priorities, the state of the art, basically. And then a second step, which was about defining, so going a bit more in depth, trying to understand what were the root causes of some challenges or the eventual consequences of addressing a priority rather than another. The second phase instead was that of developing, so what I mentioned before as co-designing with the local community, so co-formulating tourism strategies, policies, devising new ideas, imagining products and services that could help develop the tourist destination. And finally, we had the actual deliver phase, so the implementation and evaluation phase. Although already at this stage, it might be good to stress that a major, let's say, limit of this project was the fact that when it was drafted, all was thought about unless the funding for the pilot interventions. So what I will present to you in terms of afterlife strategy and what will come next was unfortunately not, I mean, the project was not equipped to, support it financially. So it is, and it will be a lot up to the, local stakeholders to work on it and find the, sorry, but I cannot, can you hear me? Is it?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Working properly? Okay, great. I don't know why I cannot change the slide. Okay, so in the second phase, so once the, let's say, living labs were set, several activities were undertaken. One of them, which was also the main in terms of the overall objectives of the Living Labs, were the activities, the UNESCO's awareness raising and capacity building activities. So the idea was really to, first and foremost, of course, raise awareness on UNESCO standards, UNESCO's principles, UNESCO's tools, but then to combine them with local priorities. So in close consultation, thanks to the lab managers with Living Lab stakeholders, we engaged in a dialogue that then led to the identification of three main topics that could have been of real interest and could have had a real impact on each specific Living Lab. So there was a kind of co-design of such programs that then were delivered. So the 6 Living Labs could choose among 3 topics, those that you see on the screen. The first one is the broader UNESCO's approach to sustainable cultural tourism destination management, which means a lot. It has very different, than focuses, and those focus were tailored on the specific destination. A focus on the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, which indeed was a module that was delivered in the Split Living Lab by our friend Tamara. And the last was about the role of visitor centers in UNESCO designated sites, which is an initiative taking the move from an activity that was developed by the UNESCO office in Venice and that benefited in the specific case the city of Vicenza, which is indeed a UNESCO World Heritage property. So what were these kind of actions? They were pilot actions in the sense that they, of course, were not pretending to address and fill all the knowledge gaps of the stakeholders that, by the way, were very different among them, coming from the very different backgrounds as well. But at least they were, this kind of soft approach was aimed at addressing all different areas in which capacities reside, in the awareness that only through a proper and well-established cooperation, this destination could have gone towards more sustainable forms of cultural tourism. Again, these were organized in a participatory manner, very much needs-driven, very much tailored, so context-sensitive, and based on the actual needs, so the situation analysis that was conducted by the lab managers at the stage of the development of the terms of reference. This is the overview. As you will see, most of the Living Labs, 4 out of 6, chose this training on UNESCO's general approach to sustainable cultural tourism destination management that actually derives from the so-called World Heritage Sustainable Tourism Program. But then throughout the years, it was expanded and developed to be applicable, not really anymore at site level, at World Heritage site level, but more broadly at destination level. Right now, we have I believe you know him, Peter De Bryan is the colleague who is responsible for this whole stream of work within UNESCO. Then, as mentioned, we had an activity in Split that was also the more structured one, I would say, on intangible cultural heritage safeguarding, with activities targeting different communities in the metropolitan area of Split. And lastly, the one in Vicenza that was focusing on the role that the establishment of a visitor center, of the enhancement of a visitor center would have, the added value that this would have brought to the overall management of the UNESCO designated site. These are some shots from the 6 destinations that were taken during the capacity building actions. And from the pictures already, you can see how different the 6 Living Labs were. For location, 3 of them were rural areas, 3 of them were urban areas. It was, I have to say, a very much engaging experience with a lot of exercises with the local community. using those tools that I was mentioning before, and that can be found on the Smart Culture Toolkit on the website. So the idea that came while we knew that we had to assess and evaluate the overall performance of the living labs, but we did it together with the Module University, which is based in Vienna, with an idea of also looking into the actual impact of the living labs and more specifically of the awareness raising and capacity building actions, given that these were the main, that knowledge advancement was the main objective of the living labs per se. And indeed, we will see that in the next slides. Let's say that from now onwards, especially the last part of the presentation, is very much informed and based on the findings of this assessment and evaluation. So these capacity building actions not only enhanced skills, but allowed also for identifying potential interventions to be implemented at local level, and especially to be helped somehow raise awareness and sensitize local authorities towards the needs of the local communities. The key principles of the living labs is that of having stakeholders on an equal footing. So everyone has, there's must not be a power imbalance. Everyone has the same rights to talk. Everyone has the same rights to, express its idea and being heard. And this is, of course, a lot also about how lab managers are capable of doing such a job. Of course, facilitating and communicating is not always the same thing, but still the living labs allowed for people from the same destination with, a common interest, but somehow with clashing narratives and clashing priorities to talk and interact in a non-threatening environment, which I would say was the main result overall. We will see later on what was let's say the findings and the results of the evaluation conducted by the University of Module, but just to say that indeed after each capacity building activity, we conducted a feedback analysis. We gathered feedback from participants, and those actions were seen as the most significant, one of the most significant added values brought in by the project. So this to say that it's true, we didn't have funds to actually support the implementation of those actions, of these so-called sustainable cultural tourism interventions, but the fact of creating the conditions for them to then follow up on them was already very much significant per se. These are the interventions that actually were implemented and let's say for which the conditions were put. Some of them were actually implemented because they were not particularly expensive, or for some of them funds were available by local municipalities, regional local authorities. And here in the presentation, you have the links. So you can go on the Smart Culture website and have a look to see to what extent they were different among them and very context specific, and very much, touching upon not only cultural and natural heritage, but also intangible cultural heritage, cultural and creative industries, etc. Another activities that was implemented within the labs and that was pretty, I have to say, successful were these exchange visit learnings. Basically, as I mentioned, the 6 labs were 3 of them were urban labs, 3 of them were rural ones. So basically, we organized exchange visits among the 2 groups. Each living lab went to visit the other 2. which allowed to, exchange experience, create partnership, but also exchange good practices vis-a-vis common challenges that sometimes, even if different territories, but still those destinations had. So here we start, and I want to close in 5 minutes, possibly. Tamara, just stop me if I'm going too long. But I think this is the most interesting part of the presentation, because what we said so far was what was done. What we are seeing from now onwards is what we will like, and we would advise other projects, other people, other facilitators using the Living Labs tool do in order to ensure the best possible results and actually the fulfillment of the ultimate objectives of Living Labs, which is meaningfully engage local communities towards, a common goal. So let's start from the challenges that we found. As I mentioned, we started this whole project in the full COVID outbreak. So this made, very difficult at the very beginning to make people meet, and starting kickoffing online was a bit harsh. But we managed to do so, and we managed also to then switch to the hybrid or in-person modality. The main issue overall was the fact that stakeholders were not very much, not always very much engaged. Now, there is an issue here, which is the fact that the participation was purely and solely on a voluntary base. So, of course, someone who has his or her own private business might have less interest in joining such kind of activities than someone who is working for a public entity, or that is working for an NGO or a CSO, also in terms of how much sensible the sensitivity, let's say, of these different branches and domains. Another main challenge, but from the point of view of the project, let's say, was the fact that these 6 living labs were very different among themselves. So the comparability of results was a major issue. But at the same time, this had to be balanced with the need for flexibility, which is exactly what we have been saying so far regarding the need to be context sensitive, to be needs driven, etc. And then the fact that they're not called laboratories, but they're called living laboratories, meaning that the ongoing, the ultimate essence of this kind of entities is the fact of being changing, of adapting to changing circumstances, of adapting to the fact that some stakeholders might step in and out at different times and moments, based on also what is the actual activity and focus of the discussion. A major issue, but I mentioned this already, was the funding, because sometimes these kind of projects tend to raise expectations that then cannot be met. So I was not there when the the product was drafted, but from after the implementation of this project, I'm usually very careful of ensuring that part of the budget is really taken into account and committed for the actual implementation and translation into reality, let's say, of the ideas or findings. So what are the key recommendations that stem out of this project? They need to very clearly define what are the ambitions and expectations, not only to ensure that there is not a disentanglement, let's say, on the side of stakeholders, but also to ensure that it's very clear what is the final objective of what stakeholders are called to do. Because this allows a lot to increase engagement at local level. Then the appointment of a local lab manager for the reasons that I already explained. They know the context. In the specific case, they knew very well the destinations. They already had a partners network, so this helped them more easily gather local stakeholders also from different backgrounds. And they knew and anticipated most often the challenges that they could have encountered due to the existing clashes within local communities. Working in local language is key, and it is key especially for what I was saying with regards to creating a non-threatening environment. We had the opportunity to deliver, for instance, the capacity building actions in local language only in Italy and in Croatia. But it's also true that in Rotterdam, Gelderland, especially, they speak a very good English. They spoke, I mean, the local stakeholders involved. So it was definitely easier, but this is an issue, and this can hinder and jeopardize the actual work of living labs. So if whenever possible, let's try to use local languages. Another key recommendation, and this is also a lesson learned, is that framing or embedding these kind of entities, the living labs, into already existing initiatives and structures, not only helps avoiding sorry, duplication of efforts, but also can be key in the afterlife to ensure long-term sustainability of the results. The creation of buy-in for participating stakeholders was per se one of the objectives of the overall Smart Culture project, and this again goes back to the Smart Culture Toolkit that I would like to show you after the presentation. They need to be flexible, not to have no one size fits all should be, written in stone, because local needs can also change throughout time, and local perception and priorities can also be influenced somehow by the activities that are implemented at local level. So let's be open-minded as much as possible. The governance frameworks that can be somehow created, not necessarily in an official manner, but still ensuring that there is a structure that minimizes uneven cooperation across stakeholders and especially prevents power imbalances. So the key role of lab manager, or as to say, of the facilitator, to ensure that everyone had the same possibility of engaging in discussion, participating, and was involved at the same level. Similarly important is the clear division of roles and responsibilities among the partners, especially considering that sometimes when you have local authorities in the group, it might become a political kind of discourse. So trying to step back from this kind of tunnels, because they might turn into tunnels, and instead trying to putting all the conditions for people knowing exactly what is expected from them and what is not expected from the others. Well, the establishment of monitoring mechanism, this is a bit more general idea and principle. The importance of, yes, frameworks for evaluation and impact assessment of participatory approaches. This is really key to ensuring to reach the expected social impact. So devising in advance such kind of frameworks can help monitor throughout the lifespan of the experience, let's say, what is the actual impact that it is having. And then this last part, but it's really much linked with the afterlife and the sustainability of living labs, or any kind of multi-stakeholder entity that you may wish to create in the field of culture and tourism is handing over at the end of the experience something that can really help them, looking forward. This might be in the form of a strategy, a roadmap, an action plan, a business plan, even more importantly, so that what has been co-designed, what has been identified as priorities can be then actually translated into proper action. So what are the lessons learned? The need to be as much inclusive as possible, spanning all different typologies of stakeholders at local level. Not being too much focused on keeping participants that started being part of the Living Lab until the very end, because sometimes the fact that some participants that are not particularly engaged could leave, and this could have a positive impact, on the other hand, on the actual circle and group that remains. Ensuring that each and every methodology, tool, and activity is conducted having in mind a participatory approach and not betraying it. So being consistent when applying it. And then, of course, the need to identify the right stakeholders to have in, which is most probably the most sophisticated and difficult part in this overall exercise. Mind the human factor, but you work with intangible cultural heritage, so it's needless to say in this context, I think. Tailor also the number and frequency of the meetings to the actual availability and needs of the stakeholders. So again, being flexible, but being also sensitive towards the local needs. And then last but not least, and there I go to the small culture toolkit, is to ensure that the tools that you're using to enhance participatory approaches have already been prototyped, because these might, jeopardize the impact and the action in these multi-stakeholder entities that we call living labs in this case, but of course this is applicable to a lot of other different exercises. This is my last slide, and it's about the overall results. So as finding, we could say that the Living Lab per se was considered as an output of as a finding of the evaluation conducted by the Modulo University. The added value of the Living Lab was identified per se in the fact of creating networks, partnerships, collaboration, ensuring allowing for stakeholders from different backgrounds and with different interests to gather together and discuss and identify the common challenges, the common objectives, and towards them then devising sustainable local development solutions and interventions. That's it from my side. I was pretty long, but hopefully not too I didn't bother you too much. I just want the main page of the Smart Culture website, just for you to know, should you wish to have a look at the tools that were developed within the project, you have them here. And the toolkit per se, also the Smart Culture game is a participatory approach. It's a kind of a role game. But the toolkit, if I manage to open it, is very interesting, because there you have plenty of tools that are already, prototyped, and you have all the instructions on how to use them and in which context and for what purpose you could use them. They're divided into, the different stages of the double diamond process model that I showed you before. And each of them has its own standing vis-a-vis the specific objectives that you have for that multi-stakeholder session. This is all from my side. Again, hopefully it was not too boring. And I'm open to any kind of questions, should you have any.
Yeah, it was very informative. And actually, I have to say that some of us here in the group are working on a new project on ICH and tourism. And I think that all of these insights that you shared and tips will be very helpful in our future work. I would like to open the floor before asking my own questions. Maybe there is someone else who would like to ask something. Please be free to ask.
I don't have a question, but I do agree with you, Tamara, that from the perspective of the project that we're currently doing, a lot of those elements that you highlighted are crucial for us as well. So very good to be aware of it and to take it into account when actually going further in the process. So thank you very much for the information.
Thanks to you, and glad to know that there is something going on this topic. I would be, glad to support as if needed and as appropriate. Be aware that basically all the information that I shared, also in terms of deliverables, are available on the Smart Culture website. So if you go on the deliverables section, you will find, for instance, the final reports on experiences and findings from the Living Labs. And there you have also all the recommendations that were stemming from the evaluation of the experience of the Living Labs that was conducted. So I don't know if you're planning to have such kind of multi-stakeholder, engagement processes. I assume so, if it's about ICH, even more importantly. But yeah, I do believe that I didn't know the Living Lab tool so well before this project, but after that, and having had the opportunity to, work with very much experienced colleagues that had used this in the past, I can tell it's a real added value. Then, of course, it depends on several different factors and the context, etc., as we said, but still, it did work, let's say.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
More than welcome.
Yeah. Some more questions, maybe? I would like to take this occasion to ask you about the status of the Living Labs today. I understood that there were no financial resources to keep the pilots going or to start the pilots. It was more about strengthening capacities on local levels, which is great. And I think that from the evaluation, you can also see how important that is. But just to hear if there are any developments that came out of this project practically.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, let me say that when I said that the 6 Living Labs were very different one from the other, I was not only referring to the destination per se, but also they were different from the point of view that some of them had already similar entities similar to Living Labs already existing, so that pre-existed the Living Lab and kept existing after. This is the case, for instance, of Rotterdam, which has the so-called Rotterdam Urban Leisure and Tourism Lab, which is under co-managed by the In Holland University, which is a private university, and the Breda University of Applied Sciences. And so in that case, of course, the Living Lab experience was just a long step, but within a pre-existing structure. So it enriched their works, but they keep working. I think that one of the most interesting ones, although frankly I have not very fresh information about that in terms of afterlife, was the case of Vicenza, because it started as a completely, jeopardized process where stakeholders, it was difficult to gather these people. It was within the candidature process of Vicenza as European Capital of Culture. And when Vicenza did not manage to win, then the overall thing imploded. So this is also to say that sometimes, existing initiatives, you have to be very careful on what, you drop on. But then they were able to somehow redirect the experience of the Living Lab, and now they do have a physical venue, which is the International Library La Vigna, which is a food-related library. public library, which has a very beautiful space, and there they keep having some kind of thematic meetings and roundtables. So the idea of creating a physical venue was for some of the labs very important to have, a place and say, we do exist, we can still operate. Another experience but maybe you're more informed about that, is the one of the split living lab, because they were thinking of embedding basically the living lab experience within the university in order to ensure the long-term sustainability. So the key point in this kind of experiences is ensuring that there is a kind of transfer of ownership, either to local authorities or to DMOs, or so destination management organizations, or to any kind of already existing institution that can, keep the burden also of having these experiences going on. And in the case of Split, for instance, they also do have already, and did have already before the project, the so-called Split Smart City Hub Initiative, which was not focusing specifically on sustainable cultural tourism, but still, somehow envisages cultural tourism as well. I think that's all, at least this what I know so far. I have to say that, one of my, since lately we were reached out by other European projects, of course, it's not an obligation, but still my professional, let's say, ethical approach would like to go back to the partners and see if there's anything worth noticing, let's say.
Great, thank you. Okay.
I also have a small question. First of all, it is very interesting to find out about this project. I am sustainable tourism connected with living heritage is an important topic in my country, in our strategy, national strategy of living heritage safeguarding, and we try to bring more community-driven living heritage into the national tourism strategy. And that's my question. How much interest the project created for the actual national, because I'm sure a lot of these countries, I guess as my country, there is a national authority for tourism.
Of
and I
course.
wonder how much they were driven and interested to take over, to use the community-driven approach. So it's because unfortunately, there is a lot of standardized top-down approach in these national strategies. So I'm very curious.
You're totally right, Joanna. And this was indeed one of the main challenges, and also within the Living Lab. The existing clashes mainly were between, CSOs or also private businesses that are struggling to, implement activities that are sustainable and sensitive to the local context, the local community, etc., and the lack of ownership and understanding sometimes from the local authorities. What I can tell is that from this point of view, it was again very much dependent on the context. For instance, in the case of Huesca, which is the living lab that we had in the pre-Pyrenees, since it is a province organizing counties, and we did have as main stakeholder in the living lab the person who is responsible for tourism and the kind of head of the DMO at Huesca level. So he was really the person who was ensuring that the Huesca province was actually benefited and benefiting from the Smart Culture experience, and being inspired by the outcomes of the living labs. So it's that the human factor which makes the difference, but it's also beware that to gain their engagement, you need to reach out at the right point in time to the right people. A positive example was that of Scheldeland as well. But there as well, because within the consortium, we not only had the Q11 University, which was in also the lead entity of the consortium. But we also had Visit Flanders as lab managers, which is the DMO of the region. And this again helped get to the higher level, so that somehow the activities of the Living Lab could have had not could have had, but could have an impact on the tourism strategy of the region at a policy and decision-making level. So you do need decision makers. Just be sure you get them, get their buy-in. Let's say also listening to them somehow, and not only not creating, not, let's say, leveraging such a clash, but instead trying to put them in so that they feel somehow responsible also for the outcomes. They feel part of this common effort. Then it's very much dependent on local administration and the people that have those such public roles.
Yeah, for sure. It depends on the level of different amount of layers of bureaucracy and political
Definitely.
in the country, and of course the history of the different regimes of power in a country.
Definitely.
So
And I will tell you that I don't think it's a case that from this point of view, the two, let's say, best experience are in rural areas, because somehow the kind of benefit that we could have is much more meaningful for them than what we could have had in a big city that has already its standardized practices, etc. So there was more margin of maneuver, and the stakeholders were also more eager to learn and to cooperate and to network. So those kind of developing destinations rather than well-established ones.
Yeah, that's why you have in the stakeholders the rural planners. You don't have the urban planners, but the rural planners. I didn't understand why. Now I get it.
Yes, I also noticed.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's exactly the point. Then I mean, also the three cities that we targeted were very different one from the other. So there again, we could compare results, we could exchange experiences, but until a certain point. But generally speaking, it's a different way of perceiving and enacting what is what they receive at city level. I mean, if you get to have the mayor and the council in, that's great. We had this situation in Vicenza, but they just lost totally the interest when their project, the overall initiative for the capital of culture, was dropped down, and then they thought there was no added value in keep working on this. Then you have to be mindful of change of governments, So also be sure that you include both technical level people and decision makers, so that you still have some continuity once there is a turnover of political roles.
Thank you. I think we had a nice and a good exchange. We learned a lot.
I hope so.
Yes,
I hope so.
I think it is. I will just like to ask for one more time if there is any question left, if anyone would like to say something. If not, we have come to the end of our session today. I wish to thank you all for your active participation, and Costanza for her availability.
My pleasure.
And yeah, let's keep in touch on
Of course.
Continue these dialogues.
Tamara has, of course, my email address. So should you wish to reach out, inquire about, some specific activity that I mentioned, we do a lot also from Venice on intangible cultural heritage. Next week, we are organizing the 18th annual meeting of the Southeast European Expert Network on Yeah,
That's
I know.
urban.
I know very well. You're the urban one, because indeed it's about living heritage in urban contexts, which is very much also, related to what we've been discussing today. So in any case, feel free to reach out should you have any query in the future. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for hosting me. Have a great day ahead and good
Bye-bye.
weekend. Bye.
The same.